This is Unfragmented, inspired by Colossians. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Join our book club as we pursue a more consistent Christian life.
Well, welcome to Unfragmented, where Lee Bortons and I explore the cohesion of things believed with things done. Today is Thursday, June 15, 2023. I'm Kevin Novak. Lee Bortons is our co-host, and Christine Berry is our producer. Welcome, Christine. And this month, we're talking about Melvin Tinker's book, That Hideous Strength, a deeper look at how the West was lost. Of course, this book is about cultural Marxism. And if you are just joining us, you can get up to speed at Lee Bortons' YouTube channel to view past book club episodes, and go to leebortons.com to see what other book clubs are ongoing. And this week, we're pleased to welcome Alex Newman. Alex has a long biography, and as much as I'd like to get through all of it, he is, I'll just say succinctly, he's an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, investor, and consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything that he does. And I think that's great. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Our book club. Yeah. And let me just get in briefly just to some of the things you do, so that our participants are familiar with what you do. You contribute to the Epoch Times, and you're a correspondent for the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief. You are a correspondent and senior editor for the New American Magazine. You write for WorldNet Daily, and you are a writer for Freedom Project Media and also a columnist for Illinois Family Institute. I do want to say that you have your website, libertysentinel.org. And then what's most impressive to me is that you speak multiple languages fluently, and you are able to speak some other languages at some degree of proficiency. So you're an intelligent man, and I appreciate you joining us this week.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you guys very much for having me.
Well, if you don't mind me just asking you one question, then I'll see if Lee has a question for you, and then we'll of course turn it over to our participants and see if we can get some good discussion going. I did want to ask, one of the things I appreciate about the work that you do is you have an international understanding of movements and where things are headed. Most of the work I do, and most of the work people generally do, is stateside or domestically. And I did want to ask you, because last year when you were at the Christian Education Initiative with us in Virginia, you talked about this 500-year, it seems that every 500 years be some kind of revival or renaissance. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we're at about that time in the 500-year history where we could be seeing some type of renaissance or revival. So my question to you is, on an international perspective, not just in the United States, but internationally, can you give us an idea as to where we are in terms of this ongoing battle between conservatism and liberalism, where we are, who's winning, and so on?
Well, across the Western world, it increasingly looks like the church is in retreat. It looks like civilization is crumbling and breaking down. But what I do think is encouraging is that in other parts of the world, the church is actually growing very rapidly. And ironically, or maybe not, that seems to be happening in the places where the persecution is most fierce. If you look at the places where the church is really, really thriving, you have communist China, right? And of course, you have the fake government churches, the government-controlled churches where they're worshiping Mao and reading, Communist Party-approved fake Bibles. But then you have the real church, the underground church, the house churches, and they are just on fire for the Lord. You see the same thing happening in Iran, for example. Just unbelievable, the growth that's happening there in the church, people coming to know the Lord. And the more the regime persecutes the church, the more people come to Christ. And so that is truly encouraging. I don't know what God has in store. I do see some encouraging things happening. even in the United States, even in the Western world. But it sure seems like Western Europe, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada is a really good example. Civilization is just crumbling. Families are crumbling. Churches are crumbling. And it feels very much like we are already under judgment. And I can't say with confidence that things are going to get better, unfortunately. So, but no, there is encouraging news. Also, sub-Saharan Africa is just seeing incredible things with the spread of the gospel. So, despite how gloomy it looks from our vantage point here in the United States and in parts of Europe, I'll be headed over to Europe in a couple of days. Very good things happening in other parts of the world.
Well, that's encouraging, Lee. Did you want to ask a question of Alex?
Well, I was just going to affirm that I know in sub-Saharan Africa is one of the places classical conversations is growing right now. And so our people are reporting back about the growth of the church there. And I'm also very curious because, Vodi Bakum left the United States to go work over there. And so if he's seeing something that the rest of us aren't. And I got to tell you, my internet connection's unstable. I don't think I have the same tornado going on as Nicole, but I do have high winds, which is funny. I'm in North Carolina and she's not. So I apologize if I get knocked off here. So anyway, so I should ask a question. So Alec, you heard about going to Europe next week. And I know that over the last year, when you and I have been emailing or had some contact, you are all over the world. Can you share with the folks that are listening where you've been going and why you go there? What do you do? What makes you go to these places?
Well, it's a variety of different things. This trip that's coming up now is actually mostly to see my wife's family. But the reason I've lived in 8 different countries on 4 continents, originally it was my dad's job, was moving us around. So we left America when I was 4, grew up mostly in Latin America, Europe, then Africa, then back to Europe. And now we sold our house in Sweden in 2019. But so earlier this year, I was, for example, in Egypt. I was on the Sinai Peninsula for the UN Climate Conference. They every year the UN brings all the governments of the world together, all the big corporations, all the activists, the tax-funded NGOs, to come up with the newest and greatest climate treaty to save humanity. And so this year was no exception. They had some big news. So I was there for that. Unfortunately, out of thousands of so-called journalists who come there, you can count on one hand the number who are actual journalists, the number who are actually there asking real questions, getting the real story, reporting back faithfully to their constituents, to their audience, what's going on. So I kind of feel an obligation to go to these things. And the reason is, if I don't go, unfortunately, there aren't going to be really anybody, I think, asking the real questions and getting the real story. To give you an example with this recent trip to Egypt, the big story, and very few Americans even know that this happened. They unveiled the new 10 Commandments. They walked to the top of what they said was Mount Sinai. And this was an event orchestrated in partnership with the United Nations and various UN agencies. You had all sorts of quote unquote religious leaders representing every sort of tradition, every kind of pagan thing you could imagine. The Catholics sent somebody, the evangelicals sent a whole bunch of people, Orthodox, Muslims, Jews, Hindus. They flew in some guy from the Amazon rainforest with a big headdress to represent Amazonian spirituality. And they as many as the government would allow, climbed up to the top of Mount Sinai, and they pulled out these new 10 Commandments. They call it the 10 Commandments of climate change. And this is part of a much broader trend. And as far as I know, there was no article about this in the American media, except the articles I wrote about it. Now, this is an earth-changing, this is a historic development. And Americans should know about these things. I mean, Joe Biden was at this meeting. John Kerry was at this meeting. He pleaded guilty on behalf of 330 million Americans, basically saying that every tornado, every flood, every drought, every rain shower is because of the evil CO2 emissions of evil Americans. So, I mean, these are all huge news stories, and not 1 in 100 Americans knows anything about them because there's no presence of journalists there. And so that's the main reason that I go to a lot of these UN summits around the world. It's also nice to go to all these exotic destinations. This one was on the Red Sea, so I did a little bit of scuba diving on some beautiful coral reefs there. But no, my main reason was for work, and So that usually is why I travel. But of course, my wife being from overseas, that takes us over there quite a bit as well.
Well, and you're the homeschooling father of, was it 5 children?
5 so far. Yep. Praise the Lord.
Yeah. So tell us about, like, so I'm aware of your media. A lot of people aren't. How would you advise us to watch, like, and to follow what you're doing? And I guess because I see you in a variety of places. I don't just see you at Liberty Sentinel. Your articles may not even be on your own show. They may be, elsewhere, your speeches. Do you have a place where things are all collated, where we can follow what you're doing in a broader way?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have one single repository for everything, but I would say probably my Twitter feed is the best bet. Now, before Elon Musk took over, I was constantly getting suspended and deleted and banned, and so I didn't put a lot of time and effort into that. But since kind of some semblance of free speech has been restored, I've been trying to be more diligent about posting the interviews, the articles, the shows, the speeches that I'm doing as time permits, and I do try to put as much as I can at libertysentinel.org as well. But yeah, I'd say Twitter feed, Alex Newman _JOU is probably the best place.
The reason I asked is when my boys were at home, one of the things we would do regularly is at lunch, we would watch like Power Lunch on CNBC or something. So they would learn to watch the news with discrimination. And what I'd really like to do is be able to promote your newscasts to our families as something they can, eat lunch around or should follow regularly. So any other advice besides Twitter in order to make that happen? I'm giving you a chance
I
to,
appreciate that, Lee. I do a daily show, and actually, your son Robert has been kind enough to join me at least a couple of times so far. So my daily show, you can find that it airs live every weekday at Lindell TV, or Lindell TV 2 is where it airs live at 4:30 Eastern time, and then that gets rebroadcast several times each day on Lindell 1 and a bunch of other networks as well. And that I don't post on my Twitter. So I lied when I said I post most stuff on Twitter, but that's every day, every weekday at Lindell TV 2 is where it airs live at 4:30.
Okay. So Christine, maybe you could type that into the chat so that we can all direct our families to it. Okay. So Kevin, you had a couple of topics here. Do you want to go over those? Are you having sound issues? Are you doing okay?
I think I'm doing okay. I'm
Okay.
on the phone here, and I had to call an audible at the last moment, but the Lord has allowed me to arrive on time. So, yeah, I don't know how familiar you are, Alex. And
That's afraid of. Yeah, it's a funny night on the internet. I'm seeing a lot of folks.
Yeah,
trouble.
I was hoping that wasn't me, but I guess it's not. So
No, it's not you. Okay, so do any of you have any questions? Michelle, do you have one?
Well, Timothy has a question in the chat box.
Okay.
That's really good.
Okay, Tim, ask your question, please.
Hi, Alex. Glad you're on. It's nice to see you. I was just wondering, the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of media outlets sort of boldly transitioning to claiming that they're not even attempting to be objective in the way they report news, but instead to be the face of their constituency or their representative of their readership in sort of promoting a narrative instead. How do you react to that, number one? And number two, do you think that there's a counter movement to that? Is there anyone who's looking to try to restore the balance in the media?
yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the answer would be really multifaceted. In one sense, I think this is really a welcome development, because for so long there was this false pretense of objectivity. We were being told, obviously falsely, that these were unbiased reporters who were bringing us fair and balanced stories and both sides of the story, as if there were only two sides to a story. And the reality is we all know that's not true. We all know that these are ideologically driven people who, for the most part, reject God, reject the principles that God has revealed in the Bible, and who have a political agenda that is very much at odds with our historical traditions in this country, with historical Western traditions, Anglo-Saxon traditions in terms of law and justice and things like this. And so I think in one way, this is actually an encouraging development, because now there's no more pretense. People can't pretend like, oh yeah, CNN is unbiased and objective. It's simply not true. The reality is, I don't believe there is any such thing as an unbiased or an objective journalist or periodical. And so for me, in my opinion, the best possibility, the best approach to journalism is to, first of all, you always want to be fair. And the media, typically speaking, the mainstream media, they like to think of themselves as mainstream, although I think that they're increasingly on the fringe as far as regular Americans go. But, I think it's important for people to know where they're coming from. But even the people who try to be unbiased, they're not able to do that in the true sense. Because I mean, even the very basic things like, what story am I going to write? Right? What do I think is important? Well, that's a value judgment. I was just talking about this climate summit that I went to go report on. Well, I think that's important, and so maybe I'm biased. Other people might think, what outfit Kim Kardashian wore to dinner is much more important. And so even your selection of stories is going to exhibit some sort of bias. And I think bias is okay. I think the best thing to do is just to be honest with people. So, like, to give you an example, at the New American Magazine, where I serve as senior editor, on the About Us page, we actually say, we are biased in favor of truth. We are biased in favor of right as defined by the Bible. We are biased in favor of our constitutional system of government. And so then as people are looking at our stories, they say, all right, well, I know where these people are coming from. I know where they stand. But with that in mind, I do think it's critical for journalists and for media outlets to be fair. And by fair, I mean, you don't misrepresent the position of somebody, even if you disagree with them, right? I mean, no matter how abhorrent you think their views are, you give them a fair opportunity to present their views. You don't mischaracterize it, and you don't lie. And unfortunately, we really don't have that much in the so-called mainstream media in America today. They're at the point where bias is really an inappropriate word to use here. They are dishonest, I think, is a much better word to use. They're deliberately hiding things from you, where if you knew those things, you would have a very different opinion. They are deliberately manipulating facts. And, when you go to court, this is commonly understood. You put your hand on the Bible and you say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so, the media may not technically lie. Sometimes they do, but they may not technically be saying something that is false. But if they don't give you the whole story, then, of course, that's unfair, that's dishonest. And that's where we're at with the media. So I think a positive development would be for all of these media. And I think CNN has kind of started doing this. The Washington Post has started doing this more and more. They're just kind of coming out and saying, look, we are radical left-wingers. Okay. And, we're going to pretend to be mainstream, but we're pretty honest about the fact that we're left-wing. And I think that's a positive development, because people need to know that, and people need to be deprived of the ability to pretend like the media is honest and say, well, the Washington Post reported, therefore I can believe. I think all journalists and all media outlets should be much more transparent about who they're owned by, what their political positions are. The Washington Post, for example, they report regularly on things that are direct conflicts of interest, right? Like they're reporting on the CIA, to give you an example. Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post, I call it the Washington Compost, he has massive multi-billion-dollar contracts with the CIA. How is his personal propaganda outlet going to report articles on the CIA without mentioning that, hey, the guy that owns this newspaper, the guy that pays my salary, has huge contracts with this entity that we're reporting on? So I think there needs to be much more transparency, much more honesty. And I'm encouraged that people are finally seeing through the media now. If you look at the polling data, the number of Americans who trust the media is so tiny. And even that, you wonder, 25% of people trust the media. Where are these 25%? I haven't seen them. So I am encouraged on that front, as weird as all that might sound.
Yeah, so I just appreciate how you position that, because we don't want to be Christian totalitarians where we say the left isn't allowed to have a voice because they're destroying our morals or whatever it happens to be. They just need to two things: say what you're saying and expressing their viewpoint clearly, and don't expect to be publicly funded while you're doing it.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. PBS, we're looking at you. Right.
Yeah.
NPR.
So a lot of these listeners are going to be homeschoolers. Is there either a nonprofit institution in the summer, or is there a magazine or a college department where they seem to be more good journalists than average coming out of programs, so we can be looking at them?
You know, the field of journalism, unfortunately, is so bad. I mean, it is so bad. I don't know what it is about journalism, but it seems to attract just the worst kind of people. And you know, I maybe I'm included in this. You know, people who don't really have other useful skills just kind of end up in journalism by default. So, you know, there are a few publications that are doing good work. I really can't think of any journalism colleges that I would say, you know, they're doing a good job. Obviously, there are some colleges and universities that are doing a good job, but I don't know of any university programs. One that does come to mind in terms of, you mentioned summer programs. There's a little camp up in New Hampshire, up in New England, that meets every year called Camp Constitution. And I've been very honored to teach there for the last, I think, 5 or 6 years. In fact, I've started taking my family, and it's kind of become a family tradition. And one of the things that they do there that I think is so great is they have a Camp Constitution newspaper. And so they encourage the kids to kind of write stories about what's going on, to submit their pieces, their opinion pieces or whatever. And I do think conservatives and Christians need to do a much better job of training up communicators. You know, and unfortunately today, as you guys know, you know, illiteracy is at epidemic levels in our country. I mean, the federal government's data shows that most Americans either can't read or read very poorly. In other words, they're really not reading. They've just memorized some words. So we need more communicators, people who can not just write, but also people who can speak, people who can reason, people who can do good on radio. And I think that's one area where there's a lot of room for improvement, both for the church and also for the conservative movement. We need better communicators. And, you know, I'll give it to the left. They do have very good communicators. You know, as much as I dislike the New York Times, you know, I got a subscription to it when I was in college. I went to the University of Florida's College of Journalism, which is supposed to be one of the good ones. It's an atrocity. And while there, our professors encouraged us to get a subscription to the New York Times and read it. And as dishonest as it is, as manipulative as it is, as left-wing as it is, their writers are very, very good. They're really good at telling stories. They're really good at getting you engaged. They're really good at, you know, using good sentence structure and just writing good stories. And so I do hope that conservatives and Christians will make that. And, you know, I know a lot of the graduates from Classical Conversations do very good at this. You know, I've watched some of the debates of these young people who are just master communicators. But, you know, outside the homeschooling movement, there really is not a whole lot in terms of training up Christian and conservative communicators. And I think we need to do a better job on that.
So besides that Camp Constitution, are you familiar with, like, for instance, this Mises Institute in the summer, or World Magazine used to have a journalism institute? Because there are parents who really want to spend some money to help their children pursue their passions. And this is a realm where I'm having a hard time recommending them. And part of that is because we do another podcast called Markers and Milestones, where we help homeschool families hear about other opportunities besides college for their children to receive training or learn more about their passions. And I want to get a journalism program on the show, and I don't know who to ask. So
yeah, that's a good question. I love the Mises Institute. I wasn't aware that they had a summer journalism program. I know they do a lot of great work. Lou Rockwell, I think, is just positively brilliant, even though I may not agree with every one of his views on everything. I think he's just absolutely brilliant. He's a masterful communicator, and he's a great thinker. And it's funny that we're talking about this, because just last week I was teaching classes on journalism. We had up in Wisconsin, where the New American Magazine is headquartered, we flew in some of our writers and some of our editors, and we had a few days worth of classes. And I taught some. We had another individual, used to be an editor at the Washington Times. He writes for the New American now. He was with a lot of these publications. And so it was like a week-long, very intensive training seminar. You know, there is one other one that I can recommend, and I've worked with them, and I've actually worked for them in the past. It's an organization in DC. Outside of the conservative movement, a lot of people aren't familiar with it, but it's a powerhouse. It's called the Leadership Institute. And a lot of the most important skills that I learned, believe it or not, I learned from the Leadership Institute. You know, they have one seminar that they do when I was in college. This was, you know, over a decade ago now. They called it the Youth Leadership School, and it was only a weekend. But I'll tell you what, in those 3 days at the Youth Leadership School, they teach you how to write press releases. They teach you how to do media interviews. They teach you how to get media. I learned more in those 3 days at the Leadership Institute than I probably learned in the whole semester at the University of Florida. And I think the cost was like $20 because their donors subsidize it. They just ask you to pay a little bit to have some skin in the game. And since then, I did go to work for them at a college. I did a 6-month contract with them and loved it. And they do encourage young writers. They actually, when I was in college, they gave us a grant for a college newspaper that we started up. It wasn't huge. I think it was maybe $700 or something. But when you're a college newspaper, that was a lot of money. And they do have a lot of great programs. I actually flew up to Washington, D.C. to do their public speaking course. I've gone up there to do their TV courses. And so they have a lot of good courses. So for parents of young conservatives, and they're nonpartisan, of course, they're a 501c3. And so, it's not Republican per se, but they do train conservatives to win. And depending on what skill set you're looking for, that's a really, really good place to get stuff. Morton Blackwell, the founder, he has been around, and you probably know him, Lee. He's involved in CNP. Just a great guy, powerhouse in conservative circles, and they really do excellent training. I'd say probably half of the Republican caucus in Congress has been trained by LI. Probably most of the Republican staffers. There's no major conservative organization in America that you can go to that doesn't have a lot of staffers who've been trained by LI. And so parents, if you're looking for, a short, week-long course or something like that, they do provide some really good stuff. There's another one that I have not been as involved with, but they're apparently very good as well. It's the Foundation for Applied Conservative Leadership, FACL, they call it. And I'm not as familiar with their training courses, but I understand from people who've gone through them and people who work for them that they do really good work as well.
Good. Yeah, those are two good sources. My William took one course up at the Leadership Institute. And then just to be clear, I don't know that Mises offers journalism. I was just using them as an example.
Oh, okay.
If you knew of a nonprofit. So, and then what about your own, the one you just described for New American? Is that something you'd consider maybe making a second week for students? Because I know that first week you have is for your own writers.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. As we were doing this, I was actually thinking to myself, like, this is valuable. There are a lot of people beyond just writers for the New American they could benefit from this. Even a lot of the writers at the conservative leaning publications could benefit from some of this stuff. And the classes were all taught by people who have formal journalism training, people who've worked in journalism. So yeah, actually, I've been meaning to talk to the other folks there because I do think that would be something good to make available to the public and to students. Like I said earlier, there's a real need for more and better communicators in conservative circles in this country. The left should not have the kind of dominance that they have when it comes to journalism, when it comes to being able to tell stories. And, I think partly, people explain this way, they say, well, conservatives are more analytical, they're more logical, they're less emotional. But, we need to learn those things too. It's important to be able to tell good stories. It's important to be able to effectively communicate. And the power of the anecdote, as Tim just put there, it's hugely significant. And we as conservatives have a lot to learn.
So I got two current events I'd like you to comment on related to journalism and on the right, so-called right, let's say. James O'Keefe and Tucker Carlson. What happened with the two of them?
It's interesting you ask. Actually, I just spent a little bit of time with James O'Keefe a few days ago. We'll be releasing that. We did an hour-long interview with him.
Can you tell our audience who he is in case they don't know?
James O'Keefe. Yeah, sorry for the folks out there who don't know him. I consider him to be actually one of the last real journalists, not just in America but on the planet. In the sense of, because I asked him, how do you define journalism, and the way he defined it is almost exactly how I would define it, and that is exposing information that the powerful don't want exposed, and that is actually what James O'Keefe does. So his big break was when him and another girl, they infiltrated Acorn. Acorn, for those of you who don't remember, it was this government-funded community organization or whatever. And so he posed as a pimp, and he told these Acorn people that he was trafficking young girls in from Central America. I think he said one of them was 12, and and that, they were getting pregnant and they needed to get them abortions. And so these acorn clowns are talking about, well, how can we facilitate this way? Well, you don't want to put that on your government forum because you might get in trouble. So that was the big break. That was such a big story that even the Democrat-controlled Congress ended up having to defund Acorn. And that's the impact of real journalism. When you expose what's happening in the shadows, what's happening in the darkness, it leads to real world consequences, or it should. And so I did ask James about a lot of the stuff that's going on with him. Of course, he was ousted recently from his own organization, Project Veritas. Obviously, there's litigation going on now, so he couldn't say very much on the record. He did say that he wished him well. He's things like that. But that'll be dropping in about a few weeks for people who want to see that. He also shared with me, I've asked several people close to Tucker Carlson about this, and he also is very limited in what he can say. Of course, he's still under contract with Fox, and now there's going to be litigation on that. But as I see it, what happened with Fox News was a very clear evidence of what I have been saying for a long time, that Fox is not what a lot of conservatives want to think it is. And I know you go on Fox sometimes, Lee. I've been invited on Fox. I've been on Fox, and I think you get a lot more truth from Fox than you will in other places. But we've seen this consistent pattern of not giving you the information that you need, almost like controlled opposition. And people say, well, Fox is a business and they want to make money. Well, if that were solely what was going on here, it would make no sense to fire your most popular host. I mean, and that's just common sense. And it wasn't just Tucker Carlson. For the folks who don't remember, before they fired Tucker Carlson, they fired their best performing host on Fox Business, and that was Lou Dobbs. And I think the same thing was going on. Lou Dobbs was sharing too much truth. Tucker Carlson was sharing too much truth. And, in talking to some of the Fox hosts, I wouldn't say I have close relationships with any of them, but I know some. I get the sense that there's this kind of like invisible fence line around them. And so, I'm talking about like, for people who have dogs, you put these little invisible markers and your dog has a shock collar. And when you pass the invisible fence, bzz, right? So the dog learns very quickly that, well, you don't cross that invisible line. And that's how it is with Fox hosts. They're allowed to say truth. They're allowed to run right up to that line and bark, 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 yak, yak, yap. And so you'll get more truth on Fox than you would on, say, the obviously fake media outlets like CNN or CBS or ABC. But when it comes to really significant issues, like, say, the mass immigration, like, say, the election fraud, like, say, the COVID fraud, the vaccine stuff, right? I mean, you notice Tucker Carlson was pulled off the air just a few days after, first of all, telling people to pray. Second of all, telling people that the media was being bought out by companies like Pfizer. Right? I mean, these are all like third rails. These are all crossing that invisible line that you're not allowed to cross. And so I think that's what's going on with Tucker Carlson. I, for one, am very pleased to see his new show being so successful. I think Tucker Carlson was really one of the very few voices in the so-called mainstream media, and his producers used to reach out to me pretty regularly for guests, for information. So, I knew that there was people on his staff that were the real deal. These were people who really were interested in getting the truth out. And I'm just so thrilled and so encouraged by him moving over to Twitter and just crushing it. I mean, he was getting maybe 3 or 4 million people on a good night on Fox News. He's getting 75, 100 million people over at Twitter. So I can imagine the executives over at Fox News are quaking in their boots, and they should be. People are sick of being manipulated. People want truth. The reason people were going to Fox News is because they could find more truth there. And so I think Fox News management is under the impression that, well, we're Fox News, and so we'll tell people what they're going to have. And I think they're mistaken. And I saw this when I was in journalism school. My goofy professors, God bless them, but they over and over again, you guys are the gatekeepers. You're the gatekeepers. You're in charge of deciding what the public is going to see. And I'm thinking, where have these guys been for the last 10 years? Have they not heard of the internet? Like, you're not gatekeepers anymore. Get over yourself. You're just not that important. People want the truth, and you're not going to be able to stop that. There is a market for it. That's why Fox News has done so well. And if they don't want the truth told on their network, viewers will go elsewhere, and so will advertising dollars.
So another question I have with the current media is Epoch Times has really risen. Why?
What's behind that besides the cult that's against China? Or is that enough in these days?
Well, I think it is actually exactly what I'm talking about right now. People are starving for truth. They're like people in a desert who haven't had water in months, and somebody comes along and offers anything remotely resembling water, and everybody rushes there, right? And so I think that's what happened with the Epoch Times. Now, granted, they had a wonderful marketing program. They invested millions of dollars in marketing through Facebook and through YouTube before they got shut down on all those platforms. And that did very good, but ultimately you could put infinity dollars into marketing if you're just selling a polished what did Sarah Palin say, lipstick on a pig. If you're just putting lipstick on a pig, it's not going to sell. And so I think what the Epoch Times has done that's unique, that's different, that is causing so much excitement. It's now the fourth largest newspaper in the United States, and it's very rapidly catching up to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the New York Times. So hugely significant. I think the last time I looked, they had like 1.7 million subscribers. It's huge. And the reason why is they had some of the best reporting when it came to what was really happening with COVID. And it wasn't even them saying we're being lied to, we're being manipulated. They were just giving voice to highly credentialed experts in the field who were saying, wait a minute, we need to be asking questions here. And all those voices were being shut out from the Foxes, the CNNs, the CBSs, et cetera. And so people knew they were being lied to. They didn't quite understand what was going on. And so the Epoch Times capitalized on that. They did a great job. Yeah, very good. Exactly. The 2020 election irregularities. Very few media outlets were willing to talk about those things. I mean, even my own work for them, right? The articles and the columns that I'm publishing there, these are things that very few, major publications would be interested in. If I were to submit columns on the history of public education, the true history of public education, to the New York Times or the Washington Post or even the Wall Street Journal, the chance that they would publish that is very, very slim. The Epoch Times did it, and they were rewarded for that. Those were very, very popular series. So there is a real hunger for truth, and people are searching for it desperately. And when a publication comes along that is offering that, combined with a good marketing program, they're going to benefit from that.
That's something for those that haven't paid a lot of attention to that newspaper for being one of the big four. They have, like other newspapers, a politics section and a sports section and a lifestyle section, but they're the only one of the four that has actually a section called the homeschool section. So they
and
are.
They're very friendly to. And I like what they do too. This goes back to how we started the conversation. Their motto is truth and tradition. So, they're right there telling you, they're being honest about the fact that, look, we stand for something. We stand for truth and we stand for tradition. And they do very fair journalism. They do, and on their journalism side is separate from their opinion side. Clearly on the opinion side, they have kind of a conservative leaning bent. They're in favor of liberty. They're opposed to communism. They support homeschooling, things like that. But on their news side, they're very fair. They're going to quote Democrats and they're going to quote Republicans. And so I think they do a very, very good job of being fair, of bringing the truth. And I think Americans are really hungry for that. And during COVID and the election stuff, when nobody wanted to talk about these issues, they were one of the few major outlets that was willing to touch those issues, and they benefited very, very much from that.
And then I have another question. If you guys have questions, type them in or interrupt me. But Alec, tell me your perspective on what is going on with this shift among the Republicans and the Democrats. I have no idea which party represents what anymore. Do you disagree with me, or are you seeing something happening too?
Yeah, there's a lot happening. And I think one of the things that's becoming more clear is that at the highest levels, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. And that's not to say that the rhetoric is the same. It's obviously not, right? Mitch McConnell campaigns very differently than Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer. But when it comes to voting, on all the big things, they pretty much agree, right? They all agree we need to send more aid to Ukraine. They all agree that we need to keep spending more and more trillions of dollars. They all agree that the government should be doing all of these things that it's doing. And they have little squabble about, well, we think we should lower tax rates by 3%. Well, no, we should raise them by 3%. But I mean, these are very, very minor disputes compared to the issues that we should be talking about. Should the federal government be shrunk by 50% or 70%? Right there is a legitimate starting point for a discussion, but that's not what we see at the leadership level. I'm very encouraged by some of what I'm seeing in the Republican Party. I think there's at the leadership level, there's still what a lot of the grassroots call the rhino problem. There's a lot of so-called Republicans who don't actually believe in the Republican Party platform, who don't actually believe in the principles that our nation was founded on, who don't believe in the Constitution that they put their hands on the Bible and swear an oath to uphold. And that's very problematic. But I do think voters are seeing through that more and more. People are just absolutely sick of it. The Democrat Party, on the other hand, the transformation, I think, is almost complete. It has really morphed into a revolutionary Marxist party. People forget that the Democrat Party was much more inclusive, even recently. I mean, one of the most conservative members of Congress around the time that I was born was Congressman Larry McDonald, and he was a Democrat from Georgia. And he was more conservative than most of the Republicans. He was a hardcore anti-communist. He was, so anti-communist, the Soviets shot his airplane down as he was flying to South Korea. And he was a Democrat. Up until recently, you still had pro-life Democrats. And of course, you go back a little bit before that, you had John F. Kennedy, who was the president. Now, John F. Kennedy was kind of liberal on some things, but by today's standards, the media would be calling him a right-wing extremist, fanatic hate group, right? Because he still believes marriage is between a man and woman. So what we've had with the Democrat Party is a metamorphosis, maybe a dropping of the mask is a better way to explain it. But to become really a revolutionary party in the truest sense of the term. They want a revolution. They want to burn down the institutions that exist and replace them with something radically different. Gavin Newsom, just last week, I believe, came out and called for a constitutional convention. And, he's saying it's just to restrict your gun rights. I guarantee you they have much bigger plans than just restricting your gun rights, right? Once that process gets underway, all bets are off. And I suspect there is grave danger there. But, we're watching the destruction of our institutions. We're watching the discrediting of our institutions. Yeah, even the same with arresting Donald Trump. Right? And people are saying, well, that's election interference. Yeah, it is. People are saying, well, that's trying to distract from the scandals that Biden's involved in, the bribery and all that. Yeah, it is. But it's more than that. Right? I think one of the things that they are deliberately, consciously trying to do is totally discredit America's political institutions. I mean, just over the last week, you've got, almost every branch of the armed services posting, pride flags and soldiers and airmen and sailors saluting pride flags. They're trying to burn down the system. And then, as Joe Biden and many other world leaders in the United Nations all put it very famously, we're going to build back better. So I think the change we've seen in the Democratic Party is toward a really totalitarian revolutionary party in the truest sense of the term. Now, in the Republican Party, that's where the real struggle is, because there's a conflict here between those who love God, those who love America, those who see the Republican Party as a vehicle to try to uphold biblical principles, to try to uphold the rule of law, to try to defend our constitutional republic, and those who just see it as a vehicle to help facilitate the destruction and the looting of America. And so that, I think, is the real part of the battle right now, politically speaking, is what's going to happen to the Republican Party over the next few years. And I think the Republican Party primary in 2024 will give us some good hints about where this is going to go.
So anybody else have questions?
Yeah, just put it in the chat, but I read an article just the other day about Slate magazine, amongst some others, coming right out and declaring they've erred in the past by giving any sort of deference to the Supreme Court in following precedents, and that they need to stop giving any cover to the Supreme Court and instead start telling people what to think about it and how illegitimate the whole institution is. It seems like it gloves are off. Like, no longer is it a good faith effort to report at all, but instead a power play to control the whole narrative of the public.
Yep. And the Supreme Court actually illustrates exactly what I'm talking about here. the radical left, very much including the folks that run Slate, they were all for the Supreme Court while the Supreme Court was demolishing our institutions, demolishing our civilization, right? Oh, we're going to legalize the mass murder of babies. Great. You know, Supreme Court precedent, stare decisis. You can't ask any questions about that. That's settled law. Of course, Supreme Court doesn't get to make law. Read your Constitution. So they were all in favor of that. You know, homosexual marriage. Let's invent a right to a homosexual marriage. Oh, we love the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's great. Well, that was when the Supreme Court was serving the purposes of the revolution. Now that the Supreme Court has at least the potential to serve as a counter-revolutionary force, now it must be destroyed. And so I think the attacks that we're seeing on Clarence Thomas right now are a very clear example of that. You know, they learned this from Saul Alinsky. You got to, you know, there are infinite targets. You got to pick one, freeze it, attack it, destroy it, and then you accomplish your objectives. And so Clarence Thomas is their target right now. They're inventing scandals faster than we can even, you know, keep up with them. And the reason is Clarence Thomas represents the most constitutionally minded voice on the Supreme Court, which they again view as potentially at least a counter-revolutionary force, a possible impediment to their plans to burn down our system.
So we're out of time. Before I let you go, Alec, you know, we've had the cover here of that Hideous Strength in our book. And since you won't be able to join us in subsequent weeks, just so you know, every month we work on one book and have usually 1 or 2 weeks we'll have a guest speaker like you, and then we just dig into the book on the other weeks. So I want to end with the end of the book. And so even though club, we're not here yet. And next week, let's work on chapters, I think 1, 2, 3, 4. I think we're on 6 and 7 for next week. I'm going to read ahead to this, or read ahead. It says it's within the church, especially, that the transforming power of forgiveness and reconciliation should be displayed. We should not be daunted by the challenge, for as that one man dissident movement, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, reminded us, one word of truth outweighs the entire world. So Alec, I just want to thank you for working so hard to give us more than one word of truth, and all that you do for the media to keep it at least a resource for us that we can trust. So thanks for being on our show, and thanks, Kevin, for getting a hold of him, making it happen.
Oh, thank you guys. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate so much the work that all of you are doing. God bless you. Keep up the great work. Thank you again for having me, and hopefully we'll chat again very soon.
All right. Goodbye, club. See you next
Thanks,
week.
Alex. Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.